In this first problem, we have to find angle C to the nearest minute. And what we're going to do is we're going to first label our picture. So we go opposite the right angle, and that's always the hypotenuse. Remember, trigonometry is always about the angle. In this case, the angle you're trying to find is angle C. So that means opposite would be the 12, and adjacent would be the side that you don't have any information about. So here we're going to label the angle is X, 12 is the opposite, and 13 is the hypotenuse. So since we're dealing with a right triangle, we're going to be using the SOHCAHTOA rule, and what we want to do is try to figure out which of the three trig functions we're using. Here we have opposite, so I'll kind of label my O's. Here I have hypotenuse, so I'll label my H's. Here we have to use sine, because that's the only trig function in which you have both parts. Here for cosine you only have the hypotenuse, for tangent you only have the opposite. So here we're going to be using the sine. So I'm going to write out the rule that says the sine of an angle equals the opposite divided by the hypotenuse. I'm going to now substitute in, and here we're going to have the sine of the angle. Well, here the angle was x, so sine x equals opposite, which we have is 12, over the hypotenuse, which is 13. Now for these problems, you have to try to figure out if you're finding a side or if you're finding an angle. Here, for this first one, we're finding an angle. So what you do when you're finding an angle is you simply type in the fraction. So we're going to go second sine. Anytime you're finding an angle, you press the second button first. So here we're going to do second sine and then the fraction 12 over 13. So when we do that, second sine 12 over 13, we get 67.38. But here, since you're finding an angle, you always have to remember to DMS your answer. So I'm going to go to second apps and option 4 for DMS. So here you get 67 degrees, 22 minutes, 48.486 seconds. And we have to always find angles to the nearest minute. So we're going to look at our seconds. And the rule says if it's 30 or above, you round up. If it's less than 30, it stays the same. So here, since it's 30 or above, it's 48.4, we're going to round up. So here our answer, 67 degrees and 23 minutes. So the key is to remember anytime you're finding an angle, you always press the second button first, whatever trig function you decided, in this case was sine, your fraction, and then when you're finding an angle, you always do DMS. Now for this second problem, here you're finding a side, but the steps are not going to change. First we're going to label our picture. So you always go to your right angle, the side opposite that is the hypotenuse, and trigonometry is always about the angles. In this case, the angle given to you is the 73 degrees, 15 minutes. So here, opposite is going to be the 24, and since x is the hypotenuse, here the adjacent is going to be the missing side. So in this problem, you're given the angle is 73 degrees, 15 minutes. I know x is the hypotenuse, and I know 24 is the opposite. So since we're using a right triangle, we're going to use the SOHCAHTOA rule, and we try to figure out which of the three trig functions we have enough information to use. Here we have the hypotenuse, so I'll check off the H's. Here we have the opposite, so I'll check off the O's. And once again, the trig function that we're going to be using is going to be sine. So I'm going to write out my rule. The sine of the angle equals the opposite over the hypotenuse. So I'm going to substitute in. I have the sine of the angle. Well, in this case, the angle is 73 degrees, 15 minutes. That equals the opposite, which we know is 24, over the hypotenuse, which is x. Now anytime you're finding a side, what you do is you always cross multiply. We're going to cross multiply. So I'm going to put the sine of 73/15 over 1. Now here we're going to cross multiply, but since what we're solving for is in the denominator, I'm going to use the switcheroo. I'm going to basically take the sine of 73/15 and switch that with the x. This is how you cross multiply. So here I'm going to have x equals 24 over the sine of 73/15. So when the x is the denominator, what you do is you use that switcheroo rule, where you take the x, take your trig function, and switch them up. So here I have x equals 24 over the sine of 73/15. I'm now going to type this into my calculator, and the directions say round to the nearest tenth. Anytime you're finding a side, you always go to the nearest tenth. Anytime you're finding an angle, you're always going to the nearest minute. So here x is equal to 24 divided by the sine of 73/15, and it looks like to the nearest tenth, the 6 is going to round that 0 up to 1. So here our answer is 25.1.